Hello and welcome to Light Your Life. This is Tina Marie St. Cyr, and it's so wonderful to share this moment with you. I'm excited, really excited about today's interview because it's one of my favorite people, and I stalk her, and you will too. And so let me tell you what we're talking about today. We're talking about your personal goals need a long-term strategy. It's so true. I do this too. Take inventory. Am I headed where I want to head? So today you're going to get some takeaways on how to make sure you're really on the path that's going to lead to fulfillment, not just success. So there's no secret that we are pushed, every single one of us, pushed to the limit. Today's professionals feel rushed, overwhelmed, and perennially behind. Can you raise your hand on that one? So we keep our heads down, focused on the next thing and the next, and without a moment to breathe. So now, how do we make sense of this endless hamster wheel cycle and create a kind of interesting, meaningful life, the ones that we all seek? The book that we're speaking about today is The Long Game: How to Be a Long-Term Thinker in a Short-Term World. My guest is Dorie Clark. Let me tell you a little bit about Dorie if you do not already know about her. Dorie is an adjunct professor at Duke University's Fuqua School of Business and the author of Entrepreneurial You, ding ding, one of my favorite books, Reinventing You and Stand Out, which was named the #1 leadership book of 2015 by Inc. magazine. She's a former presidential campaign spokeswoman, and the New York Times described Dorie as an expert in self-reinvention and helping others make changes in their lives. That's why she's on today. So make a note of her website, DorieClark.com. Dorie, thank you for being our guest here on Light Your Life.
Tina Marie, thank you so much. Great to be here.
Yes, it's so wonderful having these conversations because what you produce is very meaningful to our world. I can tell that you think through things so in depth and really touch the souls of those people that are wanting answers on how to live better lives and find fulfillment. The first question I want to start off with is, we do seem to be in a world that is quite busy. It's forcing busyness on us to simply be productive because there seems to be some kind of comparison race we're in. And we equal that to importance, but you're describing in your book that we really need to take a different perspective, right?
Absolutely. It has become in many ways a kind of productivity arms race or a busyness arms race that we feel so often. I mean, a few years ago, there was actually a definition that was added to the Oxford English Dictionary, and it was crazy. Now, of course, the ironic thing, crazy has been a word for a long time, right?
Right.
But crazy as in crazy busy has not. And so crazy busy became the phrase that people were using so often to describe this new heightened level of busyness because it reached epidemic proportions. And in fact, there were a couple of studies that came out around the same time that I thought were arresting when you juxtapose them against each other. One of them said that 97% of senior leaders in organizations said that strategy was pretty much the most important thing they could be doing. And I think most people probably agree. If you're leading an organization, setting the vision, knowing where you're going, making choices about the future, that does seem like an important thing for a leader to do, right?
Completely.
So we're all on that page. Meanwhile, in a separate study, 96%, so almost exactly the same number, 96% of leaders said they don't have enough time for strategy.
Wow.
How is it possible that literally the #1 duty, the #1 thing that you could be doing, there's not time for? Well, obviously there's a problem. Obviously there is a huge disjunct. Part of it is that in some ways, we may be creating these conditions, that we may be kind of manufacturing a type of busyness so that we feel important. Part of it really is just figuring out how to deal with the stream, the endless stream of meetings and emails and stimuli and social media that are coming in. I mean, that's a valid thing. And part of it sometimes is just grappling with ourselves, because oftentimes we choose busyness rather than deeper reflection, because sometimes there's actually questions we don't want to be asking ourselves.
Right.
And so it's tough because it's often all those things together.
hmm And it does take time for us to, hold the flood of information away from us long enough to find that stillness in order to ask those higher order questions and then be courageous, which is in your book, courageous enough to actually face the decision points that need to come out of that self reflection.
It's true. And, I think it's important to note as well. I mean, we're certainly not saying that everybody needs a 6-month retreat or a sabbatical or, oh, well, you really need a cabin in Tuscany. Otherwise, you can't possibly
I'll
do
take one.
strategy. Yeah. I mean, I'm game as well. I think that could be great. But you don't
hmm
have to. In my previous book, Stand Out, I interviewed David Allen, who's best known as the creator of the Getting Things Done methodology. And he had an observation that I thought was really powerful. He said, it doesn't really take a huge amount of time to have a great idea. Probably most of us, in fact, have had an experience where, suddenly just like the perfect idea popped into our head, right? You can have it in a minute. But he said, what it does take to have great strategic insight is space, mental space. And that's the part that so many of us are lacking, where we just feel like it's constant reactivity, it's a constant barrage. And so it's really thinking about, how do you set those boundaries and parameters in our lives so that we actually are able to ask those questions?
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. And one concept that you share in your new book, The Long Game, is that we do need to learn how to say no to good opportunities. Could you share more about that, please?
Yeah, definitely. So, intellectually, we all know that you can't add more water to the glass that's already overflowing, right?
Mhm.
And yet, so often in our professional lives, we often try to do that. We just assume, oh, well, yeah, I guess I can fit that in.
Mhm.
And meanwhile, you end up with a day like so many of us have had, especially during the pandemic, where, it's 14 hours of meetings and you don't even have time to go to the bathroom because, like,
Mhm.
oh, well, technically there's a slot there,
Mhm.
which,
Technically. Right.
yeah, it just ends up being ridiculous.
Mhm.
And so, one of the things that is hardest for us to do, but really, really important, is, most of us, unless we're pushovers, we're actually pretty good at saying no to bad things, to offers that look terrible. But the
Right.
hard part is learning to say no to good things. The good things, like, they're nice, they're good, but it's the sort of straw that broke the camel's back that tips us over into not being able to enjoy anything because
Right.
we're just so busy, we're so overwhelmed. But we need to carve out that white space, and we need to be willing to leave enough room in our calendars for serendipity. Otherwise,
Mm.
just everything's going to be a slog.
Right. My team, I hear them sometimes saying, "Oh, we don't want to interrupt you because you're busy." And around here, we call busy the four-letter word. We'd rather say productive. I'm being productive. There's a strategy, like you said, to the utilization of time here. Yet I'm with the other professionals that you're writing about. That sometimes it feels like, am I doing what I really need to be doing or could be doing to be most beneficial to the long game, or am I simply getting things off my desk?
Absolutely.
Definitely understand that. You literally had me cracking up in the book. So there's something, the dinner conversation that you found yourself out and you were quietly smiling and you had some expletives that were going through the mind whenever you were talking about the other people were talking at the dinner table about their babies and their books and all their productivity. And we do get to a place where we can compare ourselves to others. We can look at the outside world and paint a picture inside of our minds of everybody's success and how they must have gotten there. And so I love that you say that it lit a fire in you. It became fuel of saying, okay, just had you stand up and say, I'm going to write my first book. So could you take us back to that 5-year long success story that you found yourself in?
Yeah, absolutely. I think at a very broad level, what the long game is about is the fact that, frustratingly, success often doesn't show up for quite a while. Even if you're doing the right things, even if you're, doing the work, we have to have enough strategic patience so that we don't stop in the middle and give up before the fruits of our labors have time to manifest. And
Oh,
so, one personal example of all this was, I went to a conference, and this is now, well over a decade ago. And it was a conference with a lot of successful people. And I was very proud of myself because I managed to finagle this dinner invitation. Like, oh, good. I'm going to connect with people. I'm going to make friends. It'll be fantastic. But
Mhm.
the truth was, I was the least overtly successful person at this dinner, and the conversation going on around me, it was extremely triggering because everybody, they all kind of knew each other, they all had a history together, and they were doing a tally. Most of them had gone to college together, and they were doing a tally about all their college classmates and how many babies different ones had, and then how many books different ones had. And it was just like, okay, so literally they're like enumerating the officially sanctioned life successes of all of these people that they knew. And I, of course, had no babies. I had no books. And I'm just sort of sitting there like, okay, I don't really have a lot to add. And it did, as you say, light a fire under me,
Mhm.
where the next year I decided, just come hell or high water, I was going to sell a book proposal. And so I literally, I did it all wrong. This is not what I advise people to do now, but I wrote 3 different book proposals because I'm like, someone's going to want something. And
Right.
of course they didn't. No one wanted anything.
You got good advice in the process, though.
I did, yes, yes, but ultimately, what I discovered was the problem. It wasn't even necessarily the content, although that probably could have been better too. But the problem was that I was not famous enough, and publishers want someone with a so-called platform. They want to see that you are known by enough people that you can move copies of books. And
Mhm.
so I didn't want to do this. This was not the step that I intended to have to take. It felt like a detour, but I started blogging because I'm like, well, geez, I guess I have to do something and get famous if I'm going to write this damn book. So it ended up taking, between the time of that dinner and the time when I actually did have my first book come out, it was a 5-year process.
Mhm.
And so one of the things that I think is really illustrative for me, and I talk about this in the long game, is during that 5 years, so much work was happening under the surface. But also, if somebody was looking at me from the outside, they probably wouldn't have even perceived a change. They wouldn't, all of a sudden, like, you have a book come out, that's a big thing. Well, guess what? The book didn't suddenly happen overnight. It had been percolating for those 5 years. And so it really is so important to nurture and encourage any
Mhm.
professional who is working hard in the small and subtle ways that maybe the rest of the world can't see yet, but are
Right.
the things that can actually lead to you emerging successful down the road.
Yeah. One of my mentors told me great, great words, and I hear them often in my mind. I'm sure you have mentor words that show up in your mind too. And it was stay the course, stay the course. And the course may look like it's a long course, but trust it that there are things, like you said, percolating. There are things being birthed along the process. And what would you say to people who sometimes in the midst of that hamster wheel that we find ourselves on the day-to-day grind, and that's another word in your book, that we stay in that visionary of knowing what that outcome's going to be so we can fuel ourselves and reignite the passion.
Yeah, motivation is so critical in all of this. And I think that one of the most important things that we can do is really make an effort to surround ourselves with the right people,
Mhm.
because in the moment, something that I've really learned is you can't trust yourself. Your own judgment is a little
Damn
bit
it.
disoriented. Yes, I know, right? I mean, it's sort of like, pilots who, inexperienced pilots who get confused on the, looking at the horizon, and they're like, wait, where's the ocean? Where's the horizon? They're like all spun around when they're in the thick of it. And in that case, theoretically, they should be relying on the radar. In
Right.
our case, the radar is our trusted friends. And so we really need to almost make a pact with ourselves in advance, where we acknowledge, okay, here are the people in my life that, number one, I know that they have my best interests at heart. And number two, I respect their professional judgment.
Mm.
These are the two critical parts. And if you go to them and you ask for guidance, and even if you feel like your idea is terrible or it's not working or nothing ever works, if you go to them, you need to pledge in advance that you will actually listen to what they have to say. Because if they tell you, Tina Marie, you're right, this actually isn't the best idea, then fine. Okay, move on to the next one. But if the people around you say, no, there's something here,
Mm,
keep going, then we need to believe them. And I think that's really important.
right. Thank you for that advice. And that goes along with the types of relationship building you talk about in the long game, is that there's some short-term, long-term, and then the infinite relationship building. We seem to be in a world where we are in that instant gratification and we forget about the long-term relationships that we have been building and how to keep those alive.
It's really true. A lot of people are not big fans of networking. They sort of get freaked out, they hate it, they don't want to
Mhm.
do it. And part of the reason, a big part of the reason, is that so often when we talk about networking, the kind that comes to people's mind, the sort of stereotype of
Right.
networking is short-term transactional networking. Oh, well, I'm going to get to know Tina Marie because I want to be on her podcast.
Yeah.
And when you do something like that, of course you feel sleazy because it kind of is sleazy.
Yeah, it's a one and done, right?
Yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. And so what I try to encourage people to do is, first of all, just as much as is humanly possible, don't do that. It really is kind of using people. So, I even have a rule that I suggest in the long game, which I call no asks for a year. And I think this is actually an important discipline. Now,
Mhm.
I don't mean like a silly, like a minor ask, like, oh, Tina Marie, I love that color of paint on your wall. What brand is it? That's
Right.
fine. But
Mhm.
I think it's really important that for the first year that you're getting to know someone, you not make any kind of a meaningful ask that it involves political capital in some
Right.
way, because it's so critically important, I think, for us to telegraph to the other person that, number one, we are not about that, and number two, also to just keep ourselves honest, to keep
Mhm.
ourselves from even going there. We just say no, that's off the table, so
Mhm.
that you get to know people in a deeper way. So the two kinds of networking that I do advocate are long-term networking and then what I call infinite horizon networking. And they're related in that they are both obviously about getting to know people in a substantive way over time.
Right.
Long-term horizon networking is something that probably most professionals can get behind. It's sort of like, oh, well, I'm in finance and this other guy is in finance. I don't know exactly what we could do for each other, but probably something at some point. Like, let's get to
Mm.
know him. Okay, fantastic. That's a perfectly good way to get to know someone. Amen.
Mhm.
Infinite horizon networking is what I almost call like the bonus networking. This is like extra credit because many people don't do it because it seems useless. And again, if you have a very transactional mindset, you're like, well, why would I bother? But if we really want to open ourselves up to serendipity into some very powerful ways, this is what we should do. These are connections you have with people that it looks like no reason at all. Like, why would you do it?
Mhm.
Like, maybe you become friends with a comedian in New Zealand.
Right.
Like, what can that person ever do for you? Nothing. But you know what? Over time, first of all, paths change. And in surprising ways, you may actually find yourself over time converging in ways where they suddenly do become very relevant. Also, that person might influence you in different ways. They
Mhm.
might tell you something, give you advice or ideas that you haven't heard about that could actually dramatically shape and reshape the trajectory of your life. And most people don't bother to make those relationships, but they can be the most powerful of all.
That's so true. That reminds me, I was in a uh, waiting line for just getting a meal at a deli. And behind me was a gentleman, and it was taking a while. So I just said, hey, like having a good day. And he ended up being the emergency helicopter pilot for a life flight.
Wow.
And so, my son's a pilot. So I said, oh, we learned at this airport, where'd you do your hours? And we struck up a conversation. He had a website. He told me, well, let's just stay in touch. And we Facebook friend, and then I went to his website, and he teaches helicopter flying and then also the emergency flight for life flight, right? years later, one of my clients comes to me and he wants to be an emergency, life flight helicopter pilot. That's his destiny. I'm like, I know somebody. And so
Amazing.
I connected them, and it's been a beautiful relationship for the two of them. And I would have never had that had I not taken the courage and the time to just simply say hello to a person that was behind me in line.
What a great story. I know how many coaches can hook you up with like, oh, you want to be an emergency life flight helicopter pilot? Yeah, done.
Right.
That's
I know
amazing.
someone. But those, like you said, those serendipities are around us all the time. It takes slowing down to really notice and be present with what the world and the invisible substances, I call it, is offering us to pay attention to.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
Mhm.
fantastic.
There's a word in there. I love that you share this in the long game. It's in fact, for those that may have been on our podcast right now, just eating up what Dorie's sharing with us, I want you to know that you're going to write down and put in your memory DorieClark.com. So you're going to go to DorieClark.com, her website. You're going to digest everything she has there, and the resources are amazing. Her books are so relatable. And so go find Dorie on Amazon or wherever else and do what I've done, become a stalker. It works. And so there's a word that you share in the book about something that you hate. It's a word that you really do not like, and it was patience. Why is it that the word patience is something that you went, oh, just doesn't set well with me?
Yes. Oh my gosh. Well, probably a lot of you can relate. Ever since I was a little kid, when you're a kid, you have to be patient about everything. I was just always so indignant that, like, no, you can't drive. No, you can't vote. No, you can't start a business. Like all the things that I thought sounded so cool and so exciting. And it's just like tick, 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 like you're not allowed. I hated it. And
Rules.
yeah, seriously. And then so once I got to be an adult, I mean, yay, I could drive, I could vote, I could start a business. Those are good things. But also you come to realize that there's a different set of activities that you have to be patient about.
Mhm.
And oftentimes it involves success. It involves having the kind of impact that you want to have. And one of the things that is most frustrating, and I've experienced this, when I first started my own business, I've certainly seen it with the clients that I work with. I have an online course and community called Recognized Expert, and 600 plus people have been through it. So I've really worked with a lot of folks and gotten to see this longitudinally. And so one of the biggest challenges is that in the early days of starting your business, or, sort of making a concerted effort to grow your career and kind of reach for the brass ring, there is a marked gap between the difference that you can make and how other people perceive you. Most
Mm,
other people, they're just, frankly, they're just not paying that much attention. I mean, it's not that they necessarily doubt you. I mean, maybe they do, but mostly it's just they don't care. Mostly they're just not listening at all. And
right.
it's so frustrating because you know that if you were given the chance, if you had the eyeballs, if you had the opportunity, you could really make a difference. And instead, it's just like crickets, and you have to hustle so hard to sort of get the attention, or to land the client, or whatever you're
Right.
trying to do. And so being patient about that is so extraordinarily frustrating, especially when it feels like you look around and it's like, oh, well, it seems like everybody else on Instagram has it all figured out. And so that's why in the long game, one of the themes that I talk about a lot is strategic patience,
Patience. Mhm.
because the truth is, there's a couple ways to be patient. You could be patient where you just sort of sit back and like, well, maybe great things will happen. And that usually doesn't work. But if we can
Mm,
be strategically patient, actively patient, and
right.
just doing the work and doing the things, and knowing that if you invest enough time over time, it will work out, it will happen. There's something very powerful in that, because so many people just get discouraged too early and they quit in the middle. So they never see the results.
Yeah, I love that. Strategic patience is definitely something that we need to cultivate within our own minds and understand that progress is happening even if we can't see it. There's a saying that I have. In fact, I have it on my checks. Like, who writes checks anymore? But I decided to put a mantra on my check stock, and it's progress equals happiness. And so, anytime we can really take account of the progress we're making in our lives, even if it's getting out of bed and getting dressed, the simple progress, then add to the happiness in our life. And if we have happiness, then we can make those goals happen that are in our souls, right?
Yeah, that's so powerful, and in fact, it's literally true. It's research based. You may be familiar with research that has been done by Harvard Business School professor Teresa Amabile. She wrote a book with Stephen Kramer called The Progress Principle, and she did a fairly large scale study of professionals working in companies. And what she discovered was that the single most meaningful element when it came to a worker feeling like they were going somewhere, that they were, making a positive difference, feeling good about the work they were doing, was actually the question of whether on a given day they were able to make meaningful progress on a task that they thought was important. If you're able to have that sense of forward momentum, even if it's just a little bit, but if you're having forward momentum on something that you think is worthwhile, that actually has a huge psychological benefit. So you are exactly right.
Completely does. And sometimes we seek that outside perspective of our progress. And I definitely ask my clients and friends to first look inside yourself for your own set of rules of progress instead of just the outside version of that, because then you'll know who you truly are. I'm looking for my next question. I wanted to restate something that's in your book. I love how you wrote this so that our audience can hear this. In the long game, my goal, Dorie's goal, is to lay the process bare, the success process, how we get from A to Z, and to share the unvarnished reality behind what it takes to build long-term success. This is one thing that I've known you to be, is that person that's going to say, this is how I did it. This is what it really looked like. Here's some secrets. This is some ways to go about it. But it's that understanding, that raw understanding of what success looks like. And it doesn't need to be compared to anybody else's success. What would you share with someone who's investigating their own understanding of their success principles, and how can they have a higher view of what that looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that part of why I'm so committed to trying to share this is that when I started my own business 15 years ago, it really felt like everything was a little bit of a black box. I mean, I tried my best to figure things out. I read a lot of books from the library, and I would sign up for these adult ed classes where, you take a Saturday class and, oh, now I learned how to write a business plan, or now I learned how to use QuickBooks or something like that. And it was good. That was helpful. But there were just so many elements that I didn't know and didn't understand. And I really felt like I had to kind of invent it all myself, because the truth was I didn't really have any entrepreneurial mentors per se. So I didn't have anyone to ask. I was just like, okay. And I wanted to try to find ways to make things easier for other people, because I feel like I had to kind of make all the mistakes and scrap around to figure it out. And I want to see more good ideas get out there. I want to see good, smart people making a difference and making the difference that they're meant to do. But you can't do it if you don't have clients, and you can't do it if you don't have a platform where people actually are listening to you. And so figuring out what it took, both by my own trial and error, and then, interviewing lots of people, synthesizing it is really important to me. And one story that I share in the book is, years ago, there was a woman that I knew, and she was a very successful artist. And, she has like international commissions. Like if any artist is making it, this woman is making it. Like, you see her stuff in airports. And so I was very curious. This was not my field. So it was quite obvious. I was not trying to like steal her secret sauce or whatever. But I asked her, I'm like, how is it that you've been able to break through so much? Like, obviously there's a million struggling artists. What did you do to get your work noticed like this? And she said to me, she met my eye and she said, just do great work. And I just wanted to punch her. I'm like, are you either that dumb that you really think that's the answer? Or, because I don't think so, I
or
think
are
you're
you that
actually very
lucky?
smart.
Mhm.
Yeah, right. I mean, what I actually think is that she just wanted to keep it a secret because she didn't want other people on her tail. And that is so freaking offensive to
Yes.
me that someone would hoard information like that. I mean, the truth is, you can lay bare the process all you want. Other people are not you. They're going to do
Right.
it in different ways. Nobody's going to copy you. Nobody's going to steal your stuff. Like, let's have a generous mentality and help other people be able to succeed in their own ways. And so it drives
Mm.
me literally bonkers when people
Right.
try to hoard information like that. So I want to do the opposite.
Thank you so much. And yes, we are in a very prolific world with tons of opportunities. And the truth is, because I've mentored people too, it's not competitive in any way. I want them to be successful and happy. Unfortunately, the majority of people, when you give them the formulas or the strategies or even show them the way, few people are actually going to do it.
Yeah, it's true.
And so, for those that are listening, this is your challenge to yourself to take the great advice and put it in a planner and organize yourself and do it. Make it happen. There's plenty places where you can get the information to be successful. It's up to us to actually execute. There's a concept that I love in your book, and please share this one for everyone. It's your concept of from distance to empty. Help us know more about that one, Dorie.
Yeah, absolutely. So the credit for this one actually goes to my friend Dave Crenshaw, who I profile in the book. Dave is a time management and productivity expert. And part of the reason I was so fascinated by his story, part of the reason he actually got into that business was, he grew up in not the best family circumstances. And so from the time he was young, from the time he was in
Mhm.
college, he was really set on the idea that he wanted to prioritize his own family life, that he knew he wanted to get married, he wanted to have kids, and he wanted to spend a lot of time with them. And
Mhm.
so he became really obsessed with the idea of, how do you make it happen? How can you have a great living and not work 100 hours a week so that you're sacrificing the quality of your relationships that you claim are the most important? And so he
Mhm.
really tried to set out to solve that. And what one of the things that he came up with was what he calls distance to empty. And this is a phrase that you might be familiar with, of course, from
Mhm.
cars, where they
Mhm.
talk about how many miles you have until you have to fill up gas. So Dave has actually built this amazing schedule for himself. It's pretty impressive. He works about 30 hours a week and he takes 2 months off every year. He takes off the month of
Mhm.
July and the month of December. And what he says is, understandably, a lot of people go to him and they say, Dave, that's amazing. I want to do that. And they're interested, but then they look at their calendar and they say, oh, but I could never do it because I've got
Right.
this and this and this. And so, what Dave suggested, and I think it's a really powerful tool for all of us, is, it's and this is true for like running a marathon, right? Like you don't just decide to do it and then the next day, oh yeah, I'm running the marathon.
Would not be smart.
Definitely not. So similarly, when it comes to our schedules, you can't just say, "Oh, you know what? Next week I'm going to take off a month." Like that's not practical. But what we need to do is just look at our schedules and then sort of reverse engineer what is the distance to empty. So if you're working until 8 o'clock every night, don't try to say, oh, I'll take the month off. Say, how can I dial it back so that no matter what, I stop work at 7:30 every
Mhm.
night? How can I make those small changes? And you keep doing it, you keep tweaking it over time so that you're able to actually turn it into something manageable at an incremental enough pace so that it doesn't overwhelm you, it doesn't ruin your business. But when you are able to increase your distance to empty, when you are able to increase the amount of time that you can go in between having your hands on your keyboard,
Right.
you are creating more freedom for yourself.
I love that. That is so awesome. I love that concept. Um, my wife Jackie and I set this goal 2 years ago. Didn't expect the pandemic. Not many people did. And our month vacation is going to be in Africa next year.
Oh
And
boy.
so what we had to do was chunk that back. Like you said, we have to plan for it. And what are those things, the cycles, the doing that you need to have train someone else to do it and bring them in. And so our goal is that both of our businesses are running on their own by that time. And we're pretty close to it right now. So it's grateful. We're going to have another year to, work out the kinks and make certain that it's all going, and then we can go.
Yeah, that's sensational. And it's exactly right. One of the points that Dave likes to make is that you think you're going to be less productive when you do it, but actually you're more productive because the exercise forces you to identify inefficiencies and root them out mercilessly.
Completely. And yes, it's going to hurt a little bit, but it's totally worth it in the long game, right? So for those that have read your other books, how is the long game different from, let's say, Entrepreneurial You or even Reinventing You?
So the biggest way that the long game is different is that in many ways I view this as kind of the encapsulation of my business philosophy. You could say
Mhm.
that sounds a little lofty, but ultimately I wanted to write a book that was a distillation of the most important things that I've learned in the past 15 years of being an entrepreneur about how we can think about the career arc that we want for ourselves. Entrepreneurial You was a sort of narrower look at how we can create more revenue streams in our business, which of course is a really important question. We'd all like
Right.
to do that. We'd all like to be earning more money. And that's a valuable part because when you have more money, it enables you to have theoretically more freedom and more autonomy. But the long game is something that I think of as being, while it has very practical strategies in it, I think of it as being kind of slightly more 30,000-foot look at how do you want your career to be? How do you want your
Mhm.
life to be? How do you make the right choices so that you actually end up in the place that you say you want to end up in?
Right.
And especially during a time like the pandemic, many people have been forced to reckon with these questions about what they really want to do, what really is important to them,
Right.
what principles do they want to keep, what do they want to get rid of. It's a time for a lot of investigation about how we want our
Mhm.
lives to look, and so this is really a book that's about how do you apply the principles of strategy, the same principles that we use every day in our business. How do we apply that to our lives?
I love it. I love it. Thank you so much for writing this book, Dorie. It's very timely and needed. It's as though the world has been given a pause to really go into the self reflection. And this book is a perfect segue into that investigation and a strategy and a plan for us to come out the other side feeling fulfilled on purpose and definitely in touch with our destiny. Thank you. And so for those that are ready, you're going to be going to DorieClark.com, learning more about Dorie, and they could find your book on Amazon, right?
They sure can. Amazon, all the usual suspects. And I'll
Yeah.
also mention there's a free self-assessment, a long game self-assessment at DorieClark.com/the long game.
There you go. I love your assessments. I sit with them, I print them out. One thing I do caution some of the people that I give all your information to is like, I have the Audible version of your books, and I'm like, oh, I gotta write that down. I've got to write that down. And I'll be driving or jogging, and I'm like, oh, I gotta write that down. So I'm the person that will listen to a chapter like 10 times to memorize everything that you've given us. And thank you for the assessments, the additional resources that are on your website. So today we were talking about the long game, Dorie Clark's new book, How to Be a Long-Term Thinker in a Short-Term World. I know you're going to love it just as much as I do. And do check out Dorie Clark's resources and all of her books. Thank you for being our guest here today on Light Your Life, our wonderful little podcast here to help people understand how to light their life a little more and find that happiness, fulfillment, and passion in a world that would otherwise want to take it away from you. Thanks for listening, and we will be with you again on the next podcast. Be sure to favorite this podcast and share with others. Thank you, Dorie.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.